The table was set before they arrived. I'd pressed my good linen napkins, the ones my wife Patricia had kept folded in the cedar chest for 20 years, and placed them beside the china we never used on ordinary Tuesdays. That evening wasn't ordinary. That evening, my son Daniel was bringing home the woman he intended to marry. I'd spent the afternoon making pot roast the way my mother had taught me, low and slow, with carrots and pearl onions and enough garlic to keep the whole neighborhood honest. The house smelled the way a house should smell when someone cares about it. I stood back and looked at the dining room. The solid oak table I'd bought when Daniel was still in diapers, the framed photograph of Patricia on the sideboard, the late Georgia light coming through the windows in long amber lines. 64 years had taught me one thing clearly. First impressions are made in seconds and undone over a lifetime. The doorbell rang at 6:15. I opened the door with a genuine smile. Daniel stood on the front porch in a collared shirt he'd clearly ironed, which told me he was nervous. Beside him stood a woman with dark hair and very good posture, and the kind of eyes that never quite land on anything for long, always measuring, always tallying. She was dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's car payments. "Dad, this is Cassandra," Daniel said, and I could hear the hope in his voice, fragile as old glass. I extended my hand. "Raymond, it's wonderful to finally meet you." She shook it and smiled, and then her eyes moved up to my face and stayed there a half-second too long. "Well," she said, glancing at Daniel with a small laugh. "Daniel said you were distinguished. He didn't mention you looked like you'd seen the inside of a few too many bar fights." The laugh was light, playful almost, the kind of delivery that makes cruelty sound like charm. Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite an apology. I held the door open wider. "Come on in. Dinner's ready." She walked past me the way people walk through hotels when they're checking if the room is up to their standard. Her eyes swept the hallway, the coat rack, the framed prints Patricia had chosen, impressionist landscapes she'd loved. Cassandra paused at the entrance to the living room and let her gaze travel slowly from the baseboards to the crown molding to the fireplace mantel. "Cozy," she said, and the word had the texture of a verdict. We sat down to eat. I served the pot roast and poured the wine and watched her study the room the way I once studied chest x-rays looking for something wrong. She asked me how long I'd lived in the house, asked me whether I ever thought about downsizing, mentioned that the neighborhood had changed over the years. Hadn't it? She asked what I did with my time now that I was retired. "I keep busy," I said. "I'm sure." She cut a small piece of roast and chewed it without pleasure. "It must be strange, all this space for one person. 4 bedrooms, wasn't it, Daniel?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad's always been attached to the place." "Of course." She smiled at me over her wine glass. Sentimental value. Something in her tone made me set my fork down very carefully. She wasn't making conversation. She was doing something else. She was establishing terms. I looked at my son. He was looking at his plate. I said, "Thank you both for coming. I'll clear the dishes." She looked up, mildly surprised. Dinner had barely started. "I think," I said, keeping my voice even, "that we've all said enough for one evening." Cassandra's expression did something complicated, and then settled into the practiced warmth she'd worn at the door. "Of course, we'll pick this up another time." She laid her napkin on the table as if she were folding a flag. After they left, I stood at the kitchen sink washing the dishes Patricia used to say were too nice for the dishwasher. The water was hot enough to hurt my hands, and I let it be. I stood there a long time going over the evening in my mind. And the longer I stood there, the colder the feeling in my chest became. Not anger. Something more precise than anger. I had spent 31 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon. I had stood at operating tables while people's hearts lay open in my hands. I had learned very early that the difference between a complication and a catastrophe was almost always whether you saw it coming. Cassandra Holloway had come into my house and looked at it the way a person looks at something they already own. I didn't sleep well. I sat in the armchair by the window and thought through what I'd seen clearly and without sentiment. A woman who insulted a stranger's appearance within 10 seconds of introduction. A son who laughed instead of speaking. A line of conversation that moved, every time, toward the house, the space, the cost of keeping it. By the time the sun started coming up over the neighbor's roof, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to be afraid of this. I was going to be prepared. The phone call came 3 days later. Daniel's voice had the careful quality of someone reading from notes. "Dad, I know the first dinner was a little rough." Cass was nervous. "She's actually been feeling terrible about how it came across." A pause. "She wants to try again." "I'm open to that," I said. "Great. And, Dad, while I have you, we've been talking about the wedding. A June date. Outdoor ceremony. Cass has a venue she loves in Brentwood." Another pause. "We could use some help. 20,000 would cover most of it." I let the silence hold for a moment. "Daniel, I'm not going to lend you $20,000. His voice changed. "Dad, it's a wedding. It's not like we're asking you to throw it away. You're asking me to finance an event for a woman I met once, who introduced herself by insulting my face. She was joking. I'm being honest." The answer is no. He hung up before I could say anything else. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, then put it down and went to my desk. I spent the rest of that afternoon making calls. My attorney, a careful man named Gerald who'd handled my estate planning for years, came by 2 days later. We spent 2 hours going over documents. I had already updated my will after Patricia passed, but there were additional structures worth building: a revocable living trust, specific asset designations, letters of intent that spelled out my reasoning clearly and on record. "These changes make your wishes airtight," Gerald told me. His glasses balanced at the end of his nose. "Barring extraordinary circumstances, there's nothing to contest." "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I want." The reconciliation campaign started the following week. I'd expected it. Cassandra called me herself. Voice softer now. Each word placed like someone walking across ice. She said she'd reflected on how she'd come across at dinner. She said she could understand if she'd made a bad impression. She'd like the chance to do better. We met for coffee at a neutral spot downtown. She arrived 5 minutes early, wore no jewelry, ordered nothing expensive. The performance was accomplished. She asked me about my career. "Daniel mentioned you were a doctor." I should have asked more about that and listened with attention that almost looked real. I answered carefully. I said I'd been in medicine. I said I was glad to be retired. I gave her nothing specific. She nodded and tilted her head and said she could only imagine how much I'd given to that work. She said she admired people who dedicated their lives to something meaningful. I watched her and thought, she's good. She's genuinely good at this. The visits started after that. She and Daniel would appear on Saturday afternoons with grocery bags, artisan bread, and expensive olive oil, and the kind of cheese that comes wrapped in paper instead of plastic. She offered to help with the garden. She complimented the pot roast, asked for the recipe, wrote it down in a small notebook she'd brought, as if she'd planned to ask. I noticed things. The way she opened my kitchen cabinets while helping put groceries away, not asking, as if she already knew the layout. The way she stood in the living room doorway one afternoon and looked at the room for a moment too long, like someone imagining it rearranged. The comment she made on her third visit about my neighbor Ted's fence. That kind of thing really brings down property values for the whole block. And the way she smoothed over it immediately when I didn't agree. After each visit, I sat at my desk and wrote in a small notebook of my own. Date. What was said. Context. I'd spent 31 years writing surgical notes. Precise observation was a habit I hadn't lost. On her fourth visit, she asked me if I'd ever thought about what would happen to the house eventually. Eventually? I said, long-term planning. She kept her voice light. There are some really intelligent options for people in your situation. Reverse mortgages, for instance. We were just reading about them. I know what a reverse mortgage is, I said. She smiled and changed the subject. I added the entry to my notebook that evening. A week later, I found the magazine on my coffee table. I hadn't put it there. It was a home design catalog, thick and glossy. The kind that arrives unsolicited and costs nothing, because the furniture inside costs everything. I paged through it slowly and found what I expected to find. small yellow sticky notes on a dozen pages. Her handwriting, neat and deliberate. Master bedroom lighter palette. Living room open concept. Remove east wall. Office library conversion. She had written the names of my rooms. I set the catalog back on the table and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard until I was certain of what I wanted to do. On her next visit, I brought it out when Daniel had stepped into the backyard to take a call. "You left some reading material," I said, and set the catalog on the kitchen island between us. Something moved across her face and was gone. "Oh, those." I was browsing for ideas for our apartment. I opened to a page with her note. "Living room open concept. Remove east wall." I looked up at her. "Your apartment doesn't have an east wall that connects to a living room and an office." The warmth drained out of her expression like water from a tub. "You've been making plans for rooms that aren't yours," I said. My voice was steady. I'd kept my voice steady in operating rooms when things went wrong, and I kept it steady now. "I've been watching this since the night we met. The way you moved through this house the first time. The property value comments. The questions about my finances. And now this." She straightened. The softness was entirely gone now, and what remained was something harder and more familiar, the person she actually was. "You're smarter than Daniel gives you credit for," she said. Her voice had dropped. "But it doesn't change anything. He's committed to me. And you're 64 years old and living alone in a house worth a great deal of money." She picked up the catalog and dropped it back into her bag without looking away from me. "Whatever papers you've signed, whatever your lawyer has cooked up, you know how these things go when families start fighting over estates. It gets messy. It gets expensive. And in the end, the person with the most patience usually wins." I looked at her for a long moment. "You should know something about me," I said. "Patience is something I have a great deal of." She left before Daniel came back inside. He found me at the sink rinsing glasses, and I told him Cassandra had gotten a call and had to go. And I watched him process the disappointment, and I said nothing more. That night I sat at my desk for a long time. I added the conversation to my notebook, her exact words, as close as I could reconstruct them, dated and timed. Then I called Gerald and scheduled a follow-up appointment to review the trust documents. Everything was in order. Everything had been in order for weeks. But knowing you're protected and knowing how the story ends are different things. The envelope from Realty Partners of Tennessee arrived on a Wednesday morning. I opened it at the kitchen counter with my second cup of coffee. It was a preliminary market analysis. My address at the top. An estimated value of $840,000. A request contact date of 3 weeks prior. The request had been submitted by Cassandra Holloway, described in the letter as a family representative. I read it twice. Then I put it down on the counter and looked out the window at the garden Patricia had planted in 2009, the rose bushes she'd chosen herself, the Japanese maple that had finally grown tall enough to give real shade. She had submitted this request on the same week she'd brought me bread and olive oil and asked about my pot roast recipe. I picked up the phone and called the realty office. I spoke with a pleasant woman who confirmed the inquiry, apologized for the confusion, and agreed to send me all related correspondence within the hour. Then I called Gerald and scheduled an appointment for the following morning. That afternoon I drove to Gerald's office and we added 2 more layers to the existing framework. A transfer on death deed designating the property to the Vanderbilt Children's Hospital Foundation. A formal letter to Daniel, on legal stationery, notarized and witnessed, outlining in plain language that the property was held in trust, that no family claim would survive challenge, and that my mental competency at the time of these decisions was attested to by both Gerald and my physician. The letter was not hostile. It stated facts. When I got home, I sat in Patricia's armchair and thought about the conversation I'd had with Cassandra in the kitchen. "You're 64 years old and living alone in a house worth a great deal of money." She'd said it like it explained everything. Like age and solitude were conditions that made a person available for taking. I had stood at operating tables in the middle of the night with other people's lives in my hands. I had made decisions in seconds that other people would spend years questioning. I had walked out of rooms where patients hadn't made it, and then walked into other rooms and steadied myself and kept going. Because the work required it. Whatever she thought she knew about me, she didn't know that. The dinner was Daniel's idea. He called on a Sunday, and his voice had a quality I recognized from his childhood, the careful hope of a boy who wants very badly for two things to stop fighting. Cass's parents are in town, he said. Frank and Margaret. They're good people, Dad, really down to earth. I thought if we all had dinner together on neutral ground, if you want, or at your place, whatever you prefer, maybe it would help. A pause. Please. There was something in the please that I couldn't dismiss. I'll make dinner, I said. Saturday, 6 o'clock. I spent the week the way I'd spent the first dinner. The house clean and well lit. A real meal. Not a performance braised short ribs, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. I set 5 places at the table. The guest room window caught the late afternoon light, and the whole house looked the way it was supposed to look, like a place someone lived in and cared for and intended to keep. At 5:40, I stood at the window and watched the street. 31 years of surgery had taught me something about anticipation, about the moment before an incision, when everything is still unknown. You prepare as thoroughly as you can. You accept that the thing itself will be what it is. You stay present. You stay calm. Daniel and Cassandra arrived first, a few minutes early. She wore pale blue and her expression was pleasant and guarded, and I took their coats and we spoke about nothing in particular while I checked the oven. Daniel drifted to the back porch to make a call. Cassandra stood in the kitchen doorway and watched me and didn't speak, and the silence had a different texture than the silence during her reconciliation visits, less practiced, more careful. The doorbell rang at 6. I walked to the front door and opened it. A man and a woman stood on the porch, mid-60s perhaps. He was broad-shouldered and silver-haired, and wore a pressed button-down shirt. She was slight, with kind eyes behind wire-framed glasses. They both smiled at me, and then the man stopped smiling. He stood completely still on my porch and looked at my face with an intensity that had nothing to do with social courtesy. His expression shifted through several things, quickly confusion, disbelief, something that might have been wonder. "Frank?" His wife said quietly, noticing him. He held up one hand. He was still looking at me. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was barely above a murmur. "Look at him." She turned to me and studied my face, and her expression changed too. Slowly, the way light changes in a room when someone opens a curtain. "I'm Raymond," I said. "Please come in." "Your hands," Frank said. He wasn't moving. He was looking at my hands, specifically, the way a man looks at something he has been trying to remember for a very long time. "I know those hands." I went still. 18 years ago, he said. His voice had gone rough. Vanderbilt University Medical Center, October. I came in by ambulance. He paused. Massive myocardial infarction. They told Margaret there was maybe a 30% chance. He looked up from my hands to my face. "You were the surgeon." The porch, the street behind them, the amber evening light, everything slowed down. October. 18 years ago. I had been 51 years old, and I had worked 2 consecutive difficult cases that week, and I had taken a third call because the cardiac fellow on rotation was still in his first year, and the case was complex. The patient had been in his mid-40s. Anterior STEMI. Significant LAD occlusion. We'd worked for 4 hours. "Frank Holloway," I said. He put his hand over his mouth. His eyes were wet. "You were in remarkable shape for the severity of the event," I said. "You recovered extremely well. Because of you." His voice broke on the last word. Margaret was crying quietly. One hand pressed to her chest. "They told us afterward, the nurses, they said you weren't supposed to take that case. You were coming off a double shift. But you looked at the chart and you said you'd do it yourself." I had no memory of saying that. I remembered the case clearly, but the conversations before and after had blurred into the thousands of others. "That was how it went. You gave me 18 more years," Frank said. "My daughter's graduation. My wife's mother's last Christmas. Everything." He stepped forward and took my hand in both of his and held it. We tried to find you afterward. We sent a letter to the hospital, but you'd moved to a different position, and then we moved, and eventually we stopped trying. But I have thought about you about that night more times than I can count. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Mom? Dad? Cassandra's voice came from the hallway. We heard the bell. She stopped. The four of us stood in the entrance hall. I watched her face move through the same sequence I'd watched her perform a dozen times, locating the social situation, calibrating her response. But something was different. She was looking at her father's expression, at her mother's tears, at the way her father was holding my hand. What happened? She said. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Frank said. He had composed himself, but his voice was still unsteady. Cassandra, this man, do you know who this is? She looked at me. Daniel's father, she said. He's the surgeon who saved my life. Frank looked at her steadily. The night of my heart attack, when you were 16, I told you about him. I told you for years that I'd wanted to find him. I watched Cassandra's face. Something happened to it that I had not seen before. Not the mask dropping, I'd seen that in the kitchen. Not the calculating coldness, I'd seen that too. This was different. This was the face underneath all of it. And it was younger and more frightened than any expression she'd shown me yet. She stopped. That was your case? He's Dr. Raymond Calloway, Margaret said softly. He's the reason your father came home from the hospital, Cassandra. He's the reason we had all those years. He's the reason you had your father at your college graduation. The color left her face entirely. I didn't speak. I waited. She looked at me. Really looked. The way she hadn't on the porch the first night, when she'd made her joke and waited for the laugh. I didn't know, she said. The words came out like something breaking. I didn't. Daniel never said I didn't know who you were. No, I said quietly. You didn't. Her legs seemed to stop working. She lowered herself onto the bench along the entry hall wall and sat there with her hands in her lap and stared at the floor. We moved to the dining room eventually. I served the dinner I'd made, and the five of us sat around the table where, months ago, Cassandra had first surveyed my house like a contractor. Frank talked about the night of his heart attack, the details he'd carried for 18 years. Margaret filled in the parts he couldn't, the waiting room, the doctor who came out at 3 a.m, the particular way he'd explained what had happened and what had been done. Cassandra sat and listened and barely ate. Daniel was quiet for a long time, looking between his father and his fiancée with the expression of a man reassembling a picture whose pieces he hadn't known were separate. After Frank and Margaret had spoken for a while, I put down my fork and looked at Cassandra. Tell me something, I said. The house you evaluated. The rooms you were already designing. The conversation you had with me in this kitchen, what you said about patience, about how these things go. I kept my voice level. Would it have been different if you'd known? She didn't answer right away. Frank and Margaret had gone still. I don't know, she said finally. And I believed her, which was more than I'd expected. That's an honest answer. It shouldn't take knowing who you are, she said. Her voice was raw in a way that had nothing performed about it. I know that. I knew who you were without knowing your name. You were Daniel's father. That should have been enough. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. I told myself I was protecting our future, that you'd be fine, that you had more than you needed, that we were just being practical. A pause. I believed it. That's the worst part. I actually convinced myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. People can convince themselves of most things, I said. Given the right motivation, Frank looked at his daughter with an expression that was sorrow and love and something harder. Not quite anger, but close to it. Cassie. His voice was quiet. Whatever you thought you were doing, this man walked into a burning building for our family. He chose to walk in, and you came into his home, and he stopped. I know, Dad. She looked at her hands. I know. Daniel finally spoke. Dad. He was looking at me. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He swallowed. Did you know? This whole time? Did you know Frank was your patient? No, I said. I didn't know his name until tonight. I remembered the case, but not the name. I have records I could have looked up, but the name Holloway meant nothing to me before today. He nodded slowly. I need to ask you something too, I said. Not tonight, but I need you to think carefully about what you saw over these past months. What you dismissed. What you explained away. I let that sit. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. I'm asking you to see it clearly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded again. We finished dinner. Frank asked me about my career, about the cases I'd found hardest, about what I missed and what I didn't. I answered honestly. He told me about his work. He'd been a high school history teacher for 30 years, which explained something about the way he held himself. Margaret said she'd been a school librarian. They were exactly the kind of people Daniel had said they were, and the disparity between them and their daughter sat over the table like weather. When Frank and Margaret left, Frank held my hand again in the doorway and couldn't seem to find words. I told him I was glad he'd had 18 good years. I told him the work was its own reward, which was something I'd believed for a long time, and still did. He nodded, and his wife put her arm through his, and they walked to their car. Cassandra hung back while Daniel got their coats. She stood in the entry hall and looked at me, and I waited. What I said to you in the kitchen, she said. About your age. About how many years you had left. Her voice was barely audible. I want you to know that I understand what I actually said, what it meant about who I'd become. Understanding it is the beginning, I said. It's not the end. What is the end? That depends entirely on you, I said. Not on your apology. Not on what you say to Daniel, or to me, or to your parents. On what you actually do. Over time, when it's inconvenient. When the old habits come back. I paused. I've spent my life around people in crisis. I know the difference between a person who's sorry they got caught and a person who's sorry about who they are. I don't know yet which one you are. She looked at me for a moment and then nodded once. The way someone nods when they accept a sentence that's fair. Daniel came back with the coats, and the two of them left. I stood in my entry hall for a while after the door closed. The house was quiet. The dinner dishes were still on the table, and the sideboard light was on, and Patricia's photograph was where it always was, angled so you could see it from either end of the room. I'd taken that picture the summer before she got sick, a Wednesday evening at the park near the old neighborhood, her laughing at something off to the left of the frame. I went to the kitchen and ran the water and started on the dishes. 12 days later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. 3 pages. Cassandra's neat script. She wrote about her father's heart attack. What it had been like at 16 to sit in a hospital waiting room not knowing. How his survival had twisted something in her, she wrote, that she hadn't understood until now. How she'd spent years believing that nothing was ever truly secure. That everything could be taken in a night. That the only safety was accumulation. How that belief had calcified into something she'd stopped examining. She wrote, I went after your house not because I needed it, but because I needed to feel like nothing could be taken from me again. I know how that sounds. I know how it sounds considering what I was willing to take from you to get it. She wrote that she'd started seeing a therapist. That Daniel knew. That her father had told her the same thing. I had not the words, but the substance. That a letter was nothing. That she understood that. That she wasn't asking for absolution. I read it twice. Then I wrote back. A single page. In the careful hand I'd used for 31 years of chart notes. I wrote that I'd received her letter. That I'd read it carefully. That I intended to let time be the judge of it, and that time was not something either of us could negotiate. I told her the foundation would remain the beneficiary of the estate. I told her that wasn't a punishment. That it had been my intention long before she arrived. I told her that what happened with her and Daniel was their matter to work through, and that I would not stand between them, but I would not pretend either. I sealed the envelope and put it in the mailbox and came back inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Patricia and I had eaten breakfast for 19 years. 2 months later, Daniel called to tell me they'd rented an apartment in East Nashville. Cassandra had insisted on it. He sounded like a man reporting something that surprised him more than he wanted to admit. "She's different," he said. "Not completely. Not overnight. But different." "I know," I said. "Keep watching." "Dad." He paused. "I owe you an apology." I knew something was wrong and I kept explaining it away because it was easier. "I know that too," I said. "We'll have dinner soon." We did. A Thursday night in September, the three of us at a restaurant downtown. Nothing formal, nothing ceremonial. Cassandra asked me about a case she'd read about in a medical journal, something about new approaches in cardiac repair. She'd clearly looked it up. I answered her honestly, and then I asked about her therapy, and she answered me honestly. And Daniel sat between us and ate his steak with the relief of a man who has stopped waiting for an explosion. I drove home with the windows down, through the neighborhoods I'd lived in for 30 years. The streets looked the same as they always did. My house looked the same as it always did, the porch light on, the maple grown tall. The garden Patricia had planted still green and tended, everything in its right place. I had spent months building walls, gathering documents, hardening the legal architecture of everything I'd worked for. All of it necessary, all of it correct. And in the end, the thing that shifted everything hadn't been strategy or documentation or any of it. It had been an October night 18 years ago when I'd looked at a chart and made a decision and walked into an operating room. A decision I hadn't thought about once in the years since. A man on a porch whose face I hadn't recognized until he said his name. I don't believe in sentimentality about coincidence. I spent too many years in medicine watching random outcomes to put much faith in narrative. Sometimes the test comes back clean. Sometimes it doesn't. There is no design in it. But I do believe in the weight of a life lived carefully, in what accumulates when you do your work honestly and protect what you've earned and refuse to be reduced by the people who would prefer you smaller. I believe in patience, not the passive kind, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and choosing to let time prove it. Cassandra hadn't known who I was the night she made her joke on my porch. She'd seen an old man alone in a house she wanted. She'd been wrong about all of it, about the house, about the man, about what she was entitled to, about who had the patience to outlast whom. The last entry I made in my notebook, the night after Frank and Margaret came to dinner, was short. I wrote the date. I wrote a single sentence. "The foundation holds." Then I closed the notebook and put it in the desk drawer where Patricia used to keep her crossword puzzles, and I didn't open it again. Before you go, if this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful for a like and a subscription. And drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are. I read every one.